In this video, I will showcase a couple of the principles of animation as they apply to regular animation and to user interfaces or UX. So for that, the principle I'm going to showcase in this case is going to be squash and stretch. So I'm going to use this graphic that I had created. It's that of a ball. And it's just a circle. If I double click in it to just examine what it is, let me switch my tool to the black arrow tool, double click it to enter, you'll notice that this is just a shape. So I am inside that movie clip. Let me go back to scene 1 and select the graphic on the stage. And I'm over here on this layer that I will call ball. Now, what I want to do first is, since this is going to be an animation that I will be doing on the timeline, I will be changing the anchor point or point of reference, that little white circle in the middle of my graphic, to the bottom, which is where I want all the animation to take place around, that would be the center of gravity of this particular graphic. The intent is to pretend that this is a ball that is coming from the left-hand side, hitting the floor, and bouncing right back out to the right. So I'm going to move that with the free transform tool. I am going to move that reference point to the bottom and snap it to that point. And with that done, now that becomes my point of gravity, my center of gravity for this ball. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set that layer to be an animated layer. So I'm going to right click on the layer and I'm going to go create motion tween. Because my movie is 30 FPS, let me click on the gray area to deselect everything. You'll notice that the properties of the movie tell me that it is 30 FPS. Then the create motion tween from the flyout menu, when I right click it, will give me 30 frames by default. So I can stretch or reduce that amount of time depending on what I need. I'm going to use all 30 for now just to showcase the example of what we're doing. So this is going to be an animation that is going to take my ball from here to here to here. So I'm going to move this ball. I'm going to move my time marker to the end of my timeline. And I'm going to move the ball across the screen. And you'll notice that it creates a path for me, indicating that there is some motion applied to it. Then around the middle of the animation, I'm going to bring that ball down to the floor. And that becomes the path that this is going to follow, that this ball is going to follow. Now, see, if you notice, my animation is pretty much linear. Let me activate my loop and make sure that I stretch all my preview area to review all of the looping, all of the frames that I have created so far. And let's hit play really quick. And you'll notice that the animation is linear, but it's moving sort of in the general direction of where my intent is. What I want to showcase, which is to make it come down, bounce, and go back up. However, as I said a second ago, this is very linear, which means the motion is just mechanical. So I want to create, naturally speaking, if this ball were to be falling, it would be falling slowly at the beginning, probably arching down because of gravity, and speeding up as it goes towards the floor. When it hits the floor, it would be going at the maximum speed. It would squash, then deform again, stretch again to go back out, and it'll start speeding up really fast and slowing down as it goes towards the next keyframe. So that's the idea that we want to create. So first things first, let's go ahead and modify the curvature of my path. That would be the Y position of this graphic. And to do so, I am going to simply use my selection tool. You'll notice that as I roll around my path, it gives me that little curve on the mouse. And that means that I can click and deform the path to best shape it to what I need it to look like. So I'm going to create that curvature that I intended to create, that I want the ball to follow. Let me test this. And so now it's following a much better path than what I wanted. However, the speed remains linear. And the speed of change here, it's influenced by the y-axis. It is the y change that I need to speed up. So in order to change the speed of playback on the y-axis, what I want to do is I want to double click on my layer down here to open up the graphic editor. Let me expand that really quick. And let me double click on that layer to open up the graphic editor. You'll notice that by default, because I had already changed the location of that graphic on the stage, it automatically created keyframes for the location values on X and Y on the graphic editor. Let me go ahead and expand my view of this so that I can best see what I have down here. And that curvature that you see right now is the y-axis. So I want to affect that one. This is the X, this is the Y. So how do I affect the y-axis? Well, I will go ahead and if I notice that it already presented a bit of a curvature to it. And the fact is that when I move this around a bit, it automatically tagged these to be nonlinear for the y-axis. So with the graph selected, if I click on any of the keyframes, you will notice that I have Bezier handles that I can manipulate for that particular property. And Bezier handles here work the same way as they do in Illustrator. That means I can move them around to affect the shape of the curve. Now, with this in mind, remember, the changes that we're affecting in the graphing editor are time, which is horizontal, the amount of frames that it takes to do something, versus the speed of playback, or the speed of the change, which is the vertical. Meaning, the lower that curve is, the slower the change will be. The steeper the curve is, the faster the change. So if I want my ball to speed up as it goes down towards the floor, this curve here should be steep in this area, and if it goes fast after it bounces from the floor, then the curvature needs to be steep and then flattening out towards the end. That's the goal. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and change the curvature of my graph by using the Bezier handles. Now, if you notice that if I click on this guy, which it's broken into two different handles, if I click on one, you'll notice that they both go back to being married to one another, and that's not what I want. I want them to remain separate. So for that to work, it's the exact same way as if you were working in Illustrator. That is to say, you need to use this tool, the Convert Anchor Point tool. If you don't have access to that tool, it should be under your pen tool. So long press the tool to open up. It will be under the pen tool, bottom one. If you don't have any of these tools available to you, remember that you can click on those three dots to expand your tools box, and then you will find the whole selection of tools for that particular set in this area. Simply drag it from here, click it, and drag it onto your tools area, and then you can place one inside the other if you want to. And when you're done bringing out the tools, you can close your toolbox again, and now you'll have access to those tools in your tool area. So let's switch the tool to this, and just like in Illustrator, I need to press the Alt key in order to maintain these two guys separate from one another, these two handles. So I can go ahead and modify them separately and modify my curve. Now with that change on the y-axis, let me go back and hit play on my loop and see what happens. Now you'll notice that my ball is going slightly faster in the center. If I want to emphasize that even more, maybe I want to go in and make that curve steeper. So I'm going to go exaggerate it quite a bit just to showcase what this does. You'll notice that my keyframes, my tween frames, are getting closer to one another at the beginning and at the end, and they're becoming more separated right around where it's going faster. And that means that I am covering more distance in the same amount of time than over here. I am covering less distance, so therefore this slows down and this goes fast. And that's actually the idea, that we influence the visual speed of something, the rate of change, by separating the amount of space between the tween frames. So now let's take a look at this again. Let's loop it and take a look. So that gives me a bit of more natural motion. There's still some work to be done on this, and you can spend your time on your projects in order to fine-tune this and get it to a better point, to a better look and feel. Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot go back and revisit that curve. You can always go back to the curve of the path and switch your tool from the selection tool, long press that tool to open the sub-selection tool, and over here in your stage, you can click on those anchor points now, and now you are modifying the graph, the actual path of motion itself on the stage. But that said, you're not changing the rate of speed that we had already created over here. So that is not changing. You have already said that because you fine-tune your graphing editor for that specific rate of change. So you're not changing. You're only changing the direction in which things are playing back on the stage, meaning the position on the x-axis. So now with that fine-tuned, you'll notice that the motion looks a little bit more natural. So that is how you would control the path and the actual fine-tuning on the graphing editor. Now let's stop that for a second and enhance this a little bit. I want to apply some kind of squashing to this as it hits the ground. So let me double click the layer to close the graph editor again. Let me expand my timeline so that I can best see what I'm about to do. And I want that to be the point where the ball squashes. So for that, what I'm going to do is I want to create this exact same frame behind it and in front of it. I want to have those values be the same. So to do this, I'm going to select that frame. I'm going to right click it, and then I'm going to copy its properties. So with that done, I basically copied all the properties for scale, position, all of the different values of that frame onto memory. Then I'll go to this frame behind it, in this case frame 15, right click and paste properties. You'll notice that I created a keyframe version of that, so they have the exact same value. I'm going to do the same on the frame right after, paste properties. And so these three frames share the exact same properties. So you'll notice that the ball sort of stops there for a second and then it goes back into motion. So on this middle frame, what I want to do is I want to squash it. Now, one point of emphasis here is that when we're working with regular motion tween, the yellow bar, the one that creates yellow bars, not the one that creates purple. The one that creates purple bars on my layers is the classic motion tween. When I'm working with motion tween, this kind, any change that I make affects the object itself. Meaning if I go in now and click on this, on my free transform tool, and then I squash this guy, the entire animation is going to squash. Take a look. If I go and do this, now let me deselect it, you'll notice that basically all of my frames got squashed except for the first one. The first one retained its qualities as it was. And that is because any change that I affect to that specific object will basically take effect from any keyframe after the first keyframe on downstream. And that is because it is object-based, as opposed to classic motion tween, which is frame-based. In classic motion tween, if I were to do this, classic motion tween will respect the change only to that frame, and that is because it is keyframe-based. So classic motion tween is keyframe-based for changes on the timeline, while regular motion tween is object-based. Something to keep in mind. So how do I fix this problem? How do I fix this after having all that work? I don't want to have to go back and try to resize things again. Well, it's as simple as what we did a second ago. In this case, the values, the original values are here. I could go ahead and right click and say copy properties. And then in this case, I don't want to copy and paste the properties because my ball will go back up there again. But I can select what properties I want to paste. In this case, I only want to paste the scaling properties of the properties that I just copied. So if I right click and say paste properties special, it allows me to select what I want to paste from the properties that I copied. And I only want to paste my scaling properties. So I'll deselect everything else, make sure that my scaling properties are selected, and then I'll click OK. You will notice that my ball went back to its regular size. Second one is squashed. Third one remains squashed, and it remains squashed for the remainder of the animation. Another way to fix this problem, so that was way number one. Way number two to fix this problem, and that's what I'm going to do on this one, on the next one, is to right click the object itself on the stage, go under transform and say remove transform. Remember, scaling is a transformation. So if I remove transform, it's going to resize this to the regular size for the remainder of the animation. So doing so will automatically bring the ball back to its size, and because the change that I made is a transformation, it affects anything from that point downstream. So this point, this keyframe, and this keyframe get reset, while the one that I had just squashed before that retains the squashing. So let me go ahead and stretch this as well a little bit, and the motion, you'll notice that on doing that automatically went back and changed the frame before it. So let's reset that one really quick. And it is good practice to remember the shortcuts for this. Let me go ahead and select the object on that keyframe, transform, remove transform. And so there you go, you have the squash, boom. And let me go back to this guy, right click it, transform, remove transform. So it's not the squash and stretch is only happening on that frame in the middle. And so when I play this back, it's probably not even going to be noticeable enough. So let me go ahead and deselect everything so that we can see it. And you kind of notice it a little bit. And that's because it's quite exaggerated. If I was doing this properly, if I was doing this as a true animation, most likely I would want to stretch the ball here to deform it so that it's almost like it's stretching in this direction. Not that bad as I just did, but something like this. I would probably add another keyframe to it and change the skewing value of it. So I probably would go in and let's see if I want to. Let me try to do that. That's the tool I want. This one. So I could just skew it this way. You'll notice that doing that created an extra keyframe, and basically my ball would be skewing. Then I would probably get that stretching fixed as well because I don't want to. So you see where this is going. Basically, it's a lot of steps. But if your animations are happening fairly fast, like mine are right now, you'll notice that there's really not a lot of need for that amount of details. So, however, if this was a properly done animation, then you definitely would want to add that extra squashing as it goes down and as it goes up. Now, there's a risk you run on over squashing and over stretching, so you need to be careful with that. So do not overdo it. Basically, only add it where it enhances the motion. You got to move these frames out of the way. So to move a frame, I'll click it to select it, then I'll click it again and move it. I'm going to move these a bit upstream. And let's say right there. And I want to, let's say, move this guy. You know, I want to reduce the entire length of this animation. So let me click this guy, click it again and move it. Click this guy, click it again and move it here. So if I want to reduce the amount of time this motion takes, and this is where motion tweening is very advantageous as opposed to classic motion tweening. In classic motion tweening, I would have to move each frame as I was doing a second ago. However, if I want to reduce the amount of time this entire animation takes in motion tweening, all I have to do is just go to the end, and you'll notice those two arrows that appear on my cursor as I roll over that last edge of my animation. If I click and drag to the left, let's say to 24 frames, now all of my frames got moved and shifted to balance out with the amount of time that I now have for playback. Let's make this more evident. Let's make it 15 frames. You'll notice that my animation got squashed completely. My timeline, the amount of time it takes, all of the frames got moved. And if I play this back, the relationship of the distance between the frames remains, which makes life a lot easier if you are going to be moving to test the animation. It makes it a lot easier than moving each frame at a time, provided that your original frames are set up where you need them to be. So that is one of the advantages of working with Motion Tween. Now, where does something like this apply in UX UI? Well, if you look at the way phones or tablets work today, or websites, you find things such as this, where you roll over something. So assuming that this is your hot area or your finger, let's say, you wanted to roll over a button, or you wanted to click on something, and while you're clicking, you need to have one of those micro interactions showing back at you what you're doing. Meaning you clicked, so something should happen to the button to indicate that you're clicking, or that you're rolling over in case of a desktop application. So this little demo here, this little prototype will show you what that does. In this case, the finger is going to roll over the button, and the button is going to indicate that you're on top of it by stretching. So that is an example of what squash and stretch does in micro interactions. So you do that, and obviously if you want to showcase this in a better way, you probably want to add some easing, just like we did with the ball falling down, speeding up or slowing down. You would want to do something like that as the transaction is happening, as the transition is happening between the keyframes. So you can always go and double click the layer and open its graphing editor to make changes to the different points on the graph if you need to do so. So I mean, it is, in this case, we're just changing the actual scaling value. So let me close rotation, skew, and go down to scale. And scaling values would be the ones that would be available to you in this case. So you would choose which one you want to work with, and then apply by adding anchors to it, changing the curvature of the different, for the different options that you have for that specific change, for that specific transformation. So you can go ahead and fine tune those as well. So Basically, squash and stretch are not just something that it's not. It's just one example of principles of animation that applies not only to actual animation, but to interfaces, to interface design, or to interactive things to indicate those micro interactions that make our life a lot easier when we're interacting with apps or websites, in order to indicate to the users that you're actually taking steps and doing something interfacing or interacting with that specific application.